Good morning. I will go ahead and get started with our webinar. Welcome, everyone. Cheryl Crazy Bull, President and CEO of the American Indian College Fund. We appreciate you joining us for this discussion of the Native Higher Education Policy Report that was recently released by the College Fund. We'll give you an overview of the report and some insights into the learning that we had. I also wanted to note that participants are muted. If you have questions that you would like the panel to consider, please enter them in the Q&A link, and Carrie will monitor those. And if we're not able to get to the questions, we'll do our best to respond outside of the webinar. I also want to note that the webinar will be posted on the College Fund's YouTube channel probably by the end of next week. So you'll be able also to access that and be able to also share the link with your colleagues if you're interested in doing that. We are joined today by three of the individuals who participated in the development of the report. I'm going to just do a very brief introduction. Derek will post in the chat links to their bios so you can learn a little bit more about them, but we wanted to spend most of our time talking about the report, and so we'll be focused on that. I'll start by introducing Rob Maxim. Rob is a Mashpee Wampanoag tribal citizen. He's a fellow with the Brookings Institution, which is a Washington, D.C. based think tank. His focus is on Native American policy issues, particularly examining economic conditions and the impact of education policy on quality of life, uh, especially among American Indian and Alaska Natives. Recently, Rob co-authored a very important policy examination of the impact of boarding schools on Native people, and you can access that by going to his bio site. Mamie Boyt serves as the president and CEO of the Institute for Higher Education, also located in Washington, D.C., serving as a policy organization. They are leaders in evidence-based research and data policy. Recently, I have produced a very valuable report on the challenges of Native identity data in higher education, which was co-authored by Native scholar and IHEP board member Amanda Tashini. Leander Russ McDonald, who is a Spirit Lake Dakota member and descendant of the Hidatsa, Sanish, and Hunkpapa, serves as the president of United Tribes Technical College, a tribal college in North Dakota. I also will note that he previously served as the president of the Spirit Lake Dakota people. He's widely recognized for his contributions in Native higher education and also in other areas of significance, like the welfare of children. He serves as the vice chair of the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, which is the membership organization of tribal colleges and university, and as chair of the American Indian College Fund's Board of Trustees. So welcome, Rob, Mamie, and Russ. We really appreciate you joining us today. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes talking about the report, and then quickly go into sharing uh, the findings, some of the learning from the report through questions with the uh, panelists. So we wanted to respond as organizations and scholars to the gap in policy focused on Native higher education and the success of American Indian and Alaska Native students. We also wanted to support the recognition by people that higher education is not only of value to individuals, but it's also of value to our tribes, that it helps assure tribal prosperity. The report really emerged out of conversations that Rob and Mamie and I had about what is a good process for us to use. So we brought together in June of 2024 about 50 people representing policy organizations, institutions of higher education, tribal colleges, scholars, and and talked about what is the landscape of Native higher education policy and what are some ways that we could respond affirmatively to improving that landscape. We view the challenges with Native student enrollment in higher education as a crisis. In the last 12 years, there has been a 40% decline in Native student enrollment, and it's absolutely critical that all of us join together to address that crisis. This report, which we'll put the link to in the chat, is a very comprehensive examination. So the report is extensive in looking at immediate and long-term actions that can be taken. It looks at ways that we can strengthen proven practices and address priorities. And we just today posted also an executive summary of the report, which we invite people to share with others. We know that reading a 10-page summary to pique your interest is a really good approach because the report itself is more like 50 pages. And while it's extremely valuable, we know that we need to generate broader interest. It includes recommendations for higher education institutions, for tribes, for states, for policy organizations, and philanthropy. I think the last thing I'll share is that, we recognize that the federal government has a critical role in supporting Native higher education, which is rooted in the treaty and trust relationship of the United States with tribes. We chose to focus in other areas because those other areas really touch the individual students and the tribes quite significantly because of their locations and their missions. So we're really excited to be able to share that with you. I'm going to start with our questions. And as we're sharing the questions, we're also sharing some links to some of the contributions that informed us as we did the higher ed policy report. So I urge you also to click on those links, save some of those materials that will provide you with access to, and read them in order to be well informed about higher education policy concerns and strategies. So I'll start with Rob. One of the areas that we identified as critical to advocacy for Native higher education are issues around data collection. The pertinent issues around Native identity, many of which are really of importance and are resolved by tribes, still spill over into how agencies and institutions collect data. So we know it's a very complex issue, but we wanted to make sure that listeners and readers of the report could have kind of a general sense of why it's an issue and some of the recommendations that we're making in order to address that. So I invite Rob to speak about that.
Cheryl. Thank you, Cheryl, for having us today and for all of your leadership on this work. It really couldn't have happened without your vision and leadership. So we're really grateful for the work you've done. In terms of data, I see 5 critical issues for Native students in higher education. But before I dive into them, I really want to set the stage about why this matters. Cheryl, you did a great job of laying out the crisis in higher education for Native American students right now, which is really strongly illustrated by that 40% decline in enrollment since the 2010 to 2011 school year. But why is that 2010 to 2011 school year significant? It's not just because 2010 is a round number, right? Like people love using round numbers, but that's actually not why that is a point that we start at. It's also because that was the academic year that the last round of new race and ethnicity standards came into effect. So more specifically, 2010 to 2011 was the first time students were allowed to identify as more than one race in higher ed data. And if you've read work by myself or our partners at IHEP or others, you'll know that Native American people are multiracial and multi-ethnic at higher rates than any other group in the US. However, because of how the Department of Education collects and aggregates data, we have no way of knowing from the Department of Education's integrated post-secondary education data system, or IPEDS, how much of the decline in Native students is due to Native students attending college at low rates, or how much of it is because Native students are being counted as something else in federal data. In our argue, that's actually worse than knowing that enrollment is in decline. At least if you know what the problem is, you can take steps to fix it. But right now, the data isn't even good enough for us to confirm what the problem is. So that makes it really hard to design good policy. So with that framing, what are the 5 higher ed data issues that Native students are facing? The first is that higher ed data is currently collected without much input from tribes and without it being shared back to tribes. And so as a result, tribal leaders, in some cases higher education institutional leaders, are left using public data, which is missing some of the key characteristics that you'd really need tribes to make use of it. And I'd say that every Native higher ed data issue is really downstream of this lack of coordination and input from tribes. So that's issue number 1. Next, federal data, it uses sample sizes for Native people and Native students that are too small. So IPEDS itself, right, which is one federal database, doesn't use sampling. It contains the entire universe of students at federally funded higher education institutions. So that's good. But other education data sets, things like the National Post-Secondary Student Aid Study, do use sampling. And so in those data sets that use sampling, the number of Native American students is often too small to do more complex analyses focused on things like student outcome or comparing outcomes across different types of institutions. So the sampling issue is the second major one. Third, the federal government's definition of American Indian and Alaska Native doesn't align with how most Americans, and I think most Native Americans, think about it. So in our discussions, we're frequently talking about sovereign tribal nations that maintain government-to-government relationships with the US. But the federal government's own definition of American Indian and Alaska Native is any person who has ancestry in the Americas, North, Central, or South America. So that's inclusive of a lot of people who are indigenous, but who may not be a citizen of a tribe that has a government-to-government relationship with the US. And so that means the universe of people that the Department of Education considers American Indian in many cases may not align with the universe of people that tribes themselves think of as American Indian. So these first 3 issues, the lack of coordination with tribes, inadequate sample sizing, and a wonky definition of American Indian and Alaska Native are really pretty universal across the federal government. And then there are 2 more issues I think that are specific to the Department of Education itself. So the first of those is that Ed makes some very unhelpful choices for Native American people when it aggregates data. Specifically, it does 2 things. The first is it top codes Hispanic identity. And then the second is it groups all multiracial non-Hispanic people into a single category. Why do those 2 decisions matter? When we say Ed top codes Hispanic data, what that means is any individual who identifies as Latino or Hispanic, regardless of their racial background, ends up counting as Hispanic in IPEDS data. Well, about 1/3 of American Indian and Alaska Native people identify as Hispanic. So right there, you're removing about 1/3 of Native students from the data set. And then IPEDS classifies all students who identify as more than one race in a blanket 2 or more races category. This category mashes together people who have really different racial backgrounds and lived experience into just a single blanket group. And for Native people, it's disproportionately harmful because about 60% of Native people identify as multiracial. So I'm co-authoring a forthcoming piece, actually with some colleagues that I have, that shows that when you take these 2 decisions together, top coding Hispanic identity and combining all multiracial people into a single group, it means that about 80% of Native students get classified into a category other than American Indian and Alaska Native in federal education data. So we're trying to make decisions based on data that excludes 4 out of every 5 Native people. It's like if you picked 10 states, excluded the other 40, and then said, this is nationally representative of the whole country. So, these are all the issues. Finally, I just say, the final issue facing Native students, and I think facing tribes in higher ed data, is that ed doesn't collect any information about tribal affiliation. So not only are we excluding 80% of Native students, we have no idea or no info about how students from different Native nations are faring. And that severely limits how tribes, nonprofits, and other entities that serve Native students can make use of federal data. So I'll stop there, and hopefully that gives you a good flavor of how really inadequate this data is right now and why it matters.
Thank you, Rob, for that kind of overview. We identified three what we called overarching issues that you can read about in the report. One of them being this significant number of issues around data, and another being the graduation gap, the need for more Native people to be supported to graduate from college. And then the third was the DEI, anti-DEI, that movement that's going on right now. So you can read more about those in the report. I'm going to move on to Mamie to talk about the importance of policy organizations and higher education institutions working with Native scholars to increase the development of policy based on research by those scholars. We realize that a significant amount of research is being done about Native higher education and in Indian country, but that there isn't a good mechanism for bringing that research into policy recommendations. So could you speak maybe from your perspective about why it's so important for policy organizations and higher education institutions to work with Native researchers and scholars in order to ensure that they are the key informants around Native higher ed policy?
Absolutely. And thank you, Cheryl, for that question and for your leadership in this effort. As Rob said, this never would have happened without your vision behind it. And so thank you for leading this and for including IHEP in the partnership. It's been just a real honor to be able to work alongside you in this effort. And the question that you raise here is a particularly important one. And it was a big part of a lot of the conversation that we had at that June convening. Ultimately, it's crucial that higher education policy organizations engage deeply with Native communities and with Native scholars, especially when crafting policy recommendations about topics that are directly impacting Native students and directly related to Native students within higher education. These scholars and these communities, they have unique and essential insights into the impact that these policies will have on Native students because they are closest to Native students and understanding the challenges and unique circumstances that they face. Native scholars, not only do they have the research expertise, which is often grounded in and centered in Native research approaches, but they also have rich lived experiences that can bring perspectives to these policy questions in unique and important ways. And I can share an example here from some work that IHEP has done. You referenced the paper we did around data recently, and Rob has just given a terrific overview of a number of the challenges at play here when considering data quality when in higher education for Native students. And so when we were putting this brief together last year, it dives into these data collection challenges and puts together policy recommendations. Our research team at IHEP, we partnered with Dr. Amanda Taccini, who is Navajo from Ganado, Arizona, and she's a member of IHEP's board of directors and co-authored this report with our research team. And she was able to bring unique insights based on her scholarship and based on her experiences and expertise, and able to connect us with other Native scholars in the space and Native researchers to help expand our thinking and our approach to this work. And there's been one tactical example I can offer here. One of the data issues that we were exploring involved different methods for identifying American Indian Alaska Native populations, whether either through self-identification on a form or verification through tribal enrollment. And so this touches somewhat on some of the points that Rob was mentioning earlier. Now, the Native scholars and researchers who we engaged with, they could reflect on this issue in ways that non-Native researchers simply can't. because they have been through various processes of either checking a box on a form to self-identify as Native or needing to provide documentation to demonstrate tribal enrollment. And so they can reflect on how each of these processes feels as a Native person, what the process was like for them, what it means for tribal sovereignty for each of those different approaches. And so they were able to bring these perspectives that, as a non-Native person myself who has not had to face those questions when filling out a form, have not personally experienced. And so helped us to really understand in new and different ways how important something that seems like it may be a really minute aspect of policy actually is critically important in terms of how we go about data collection, and that data collection then going on to inform policy change and policy development. So as we think about how to go about this and make sure that Native perspectives are thoroughly incorporated into the work of higher ed policy organizations, I think we first off need to simply reach out to Native scholars. Policy orgs need to reach out to Native scholars and Native communities to gather their counsel. And I know certainly in working with you all through this initiative, you are more than welcoming in engaging in these conversations and in relationship building. And that's the piece I really want to emphasize here, that this is not about a one-time transactional relationship, and it can't be if it's to be effective and to be true. It needs to be an ongoing, authentic relationship building and trust building work to continue to get to know each other in ways that allow us to dive into some of these challenging issues and come up with the best solutions that are going to best serve Native students. So that true engagement means working together from the start of an effort, talking and sharing ideas regularly, incorporating Native insights and learnings and ways of research throughout the process, and really getting to know each other. It's about that. It's not about sharing a final draft of a report and asking for a quick review, and ending the relationship there. Those human to human trust building aspects are such an important part of it. It also, I think, involves embedding and including Native experts within our organizations at higher education policy organizations, on our staff, on our boards, as interns, as formal advisors and partners and co-authors of work, so that we can really work together and learn from each other on this work in systematic ways to also really empower current and future Native leaders. I think one of my most tactical takeaways from the convening in June is that we need to do a better job of tapping this network of Native scholars when recruiting, especially in recruiting interns, because we often, one of the things that we really seek to do at IHEP is to bring in interns, give them experiences in the policy and research realm, and help to build their capacities to then go on to fulfilling and impactful careers. And recruiting within this community that arose out of the convening, I think, is an important way to bring more Native scholars in the early stages of their careers, to build their capacities in ways that they can then go on and lead in new and different ways. And so, for all of these aspects of engagement, I think the through line here is that we need to make sure it's not a one and done activity, but it needs to be ongoing, thorough, and really meaningful throughout the process. Cheryl, you're still on mute.
Thank you. I want to be that person who discovers a voice activated Zoom experience. I just wanted to say that in the report, we do also reference not just the ways that higher education and other organizations can engage Native people, but also some of the advice that IHEP provides. So I encourage you to go and look at that. So we're going to move on now to talk about what matters is that we are engaged with education, particularly for us, focusing on access and success with higher education, because we believe and know that the sovereignty of our tribes is closely tied to the educational experiences of our people and the education that they bring to their work. We also want to emphasize that we recognize that as Indigenous peoples, we have an inherent right to ensure quality education, that the ability to educate our own people and to ensure that they are able to have the skills and resources they need to live good lives needs to be rooted in any educational work that we do. So President McDonald, as a researcher, a former elected tribal leader, and now president of a tribal college, I'd like you to discuss how educational sovereignty is supported by federal and state governments, policy organizations, and higher education institutions.
Well, thanks, Cheryl. Great to be part of the event today. We say hello, friends and relatives. We shake all your hands in a good way. In Dakota, we say how chante washte you are not and we say these things, because our elders tell us, that if you say these things when they call upon you to do things like this, that your relatives come to be with you and help you do those things. And we don't really think about this too much at home because everybody kind of understands that. But I wanted to just start out that way because just because my relatives are coming to help me today, but also because to bring forth another understanding of a different way of life that you might not be familiar with. And and we're different by tribes. We're unique in each of our ways. So, but I think in regard to sovereignty and supporting sovereignty for tribal nations and educational sovereignty, data sovereignty, and other things, a lot of this is already happening already. And I think some of it, depending on the topic, is in its infancy stages, and some of the areas were further along. But I come from the perspective as a former researcher turned administrator now, is that the highest form of research is policy. And so we use data in order to create policy, and it helps us to set the foundation for our governments. It helps us to create laws based on those things. But it's an ongoing thing. It's an ongoing challenge, and it's an ongoing education and advocacy as the players that are within our governments, whether tribal, state, or federal, are always changing. And we know that's happening now with the presidents changing over here for the United States. Tribal elections are coming up. So we have our state legislature here, and we just, which is starting here or just started here within the last week or so. And so we're having to meet new people and introduce ourselves and sometimes educate them about how we operate as tribal nations or how we operate as tribal colleges and universities. So, but we kind of, I think Robert and Mamie kind of spoke to some of this already, but when we talk about data collection, if research is really the collection of data, whether qualitative or quantitative. And when we really need to include those tribal populations, and in some cases oversample those populations to ensure that what we're collecting is accurate and is representative of the populations that we're researching. We need to use Indigenous research methodologies to ensure that the data is accurate and the data collection is sound. When we talk about Indigenous research methodology, we, in a sense, we're talking about community-based participatory action research with kind of this Indian twist on there, with this Native twist on there that helps us to access that population. And I think you could relate if you're a non-Native, if as a Native going into a German community, that I wouldn't be able to access that community very well, even though when I was in a service, I was over in Germany for 18 months, but that doesn't really mean anything here in North Dakota in a German community. So and I think that we have to take that into consideration. And at times we need these cultural liaisons to help us to access those communities. And so whether we're going into a German community or a Native community, and just being Native is, coming from a Dakota community and a Rickarau community or Sonish community, I have relatives there that can help me to access those communities. But for those communities that I don't know, then I need somebody to bring me in, even if I'm a Native, even because that's necessary. You need somebody to speak for you. Yeah, I mean, not necessarily do the work, but bring you in and introduce you, and someone from that community that's trusted. And we realize this from researching American Indian communities, that these things are necessary. But if you go back to that community-based participatory action research model, it's not any different than that. And when we access those communities, we need to leave those communities better than what we found them in regard to capacity. There should be a better understanding of research. They should be having input in regard to what needs to be researched for their community, and sometimes, and most of the time, being driven by that community. There has to be a benefit to that community. We can't just go in just because we need to write our papers, but rather we need to give something back to that community. And this is not a whole lot different than our Indian ways of life, in that we need to give something back. And so, but there's reciprocal relationships here, and we need to realize that, and go down that good road that way, and being a good relative and trying to help those things along. So when we talk about being good relatives, and we talk about treating each other well, it's really a relationship building. So when somebody comes to your community, I know my folks, and I know some of you guys can relate to this, is that when people come to our house when they're growing up, then we always fed them. We always fed people. We always gave them. And then my folks always said is, if you don't have any food, then at least give them water, give them something to drink, or give them a coffee or something. And so, and that's all about treating relatives. And if you go into our language, when we interact with somebody, we're always, you're supposed to try to call them relative of some type. So if I'm gonna talk to Cheryl, maybe I call her my sister or something along that time. So you try to make those relatives. And if you're kind of not related, then you say Hunkashi, or my cousin. And so, so there's things like that that are embedded within our culture and language that are really important in regard to accessing those communities. And so it's important for us to understand that. And so we realize that we're not the same as other communities, but there's similarities between us. And I think we have to come to that understanding. And a lot of times when we talk about policy development and working between, across sovereigns, between tribal nations are sovereigns, states are sovereigns, federal government is a sovereign. And so when we reach across the aisle, or we reach across to another sovereign in order to partner, in order to do that work, a lot of times we want to invite the tribal nations to be there. But I think that's also a responsibility on us, is that we need to seek to be invited. And so it goes both ways, or all ways, in regard to building those relationships to make sure that you're at the table. And I think that going on that road, that'll help us in regard to informing folks in regard to what tribal sovereignty is, and coming from the Indian perspective, and then getting to know one another, we realize how state sovereigns operate and federal sovereigns operate in order to help us to better work together. So it's really a learning process. And so when we go to higher education, then I think a lot of times myself, as I didn't realize I was going to be doing research, I just went to school to be a teacher. And I didn't know I was going to be doing research and then creating policy out of that research, and then eventually becoming a tribal chairperson in order to present, and where I presented information from our tribe in order to try to enhance resources to benefit our community. And all these things are tied together. And I think I think as we go on this road, I think looking back, nobody really shared that with me. And I think we, as institutions of higher education, need to embed that into our curriculum to help our students realize the opportunities that may be available to them in order to go down these career paths that will really benefit not only themselves as individuals and their ability to care for themselves and their families, but also to benefit their communities and their nations. So I think there's, but we also need to realize that we, as tribal colleges and universities, it's not realistic to think that we're going to do this alone, and we're just going to do this with Native people. But we have to do it with our friends and relatives, our non-Native friends and relatives who are here to help us do this good work. And I think all together, and then partnering with not only on a policy level in regard to the sovereigns, but also within our state and regional systems in regard to higher education institutions, and the importance of ensuring that our students have seamless transfer between the schools that we work with. And I think that's we don't want to provide a 4-year degree to a student and have them move on to a graduate school and then have them take another semester of 2 of taking core classes because we failed to set up our program of study to align with that school that we're partnering with. So I think there's plenty of opportunities for us to do that. And then and it really is working together. It's an investment from the tribes, from the state, and from the federal government in regard to ensuring these students have the funding and the resources available in order to obtain their higher education. And we need to concentrate on graduate school. When in TCUs, we're talking about higher education. We're talking about certificates, associates, and baccalaureate degrees, but we have to push that a little bit further. And because at the level where we need to go, that's where the focus should be. Thank you.
Thank you, Russ, for sharing. I just want to point out that in the report, we have a pretty extensive discussion of the history of Native education. There's some resources about the political identity of Native people that distinguish Native people, Native students from other populations. And in our next set of questions, Russ will also be speaking about the role of tribes in some of these areas. So I'm going to go on to our second set of questions, starting with Rob. As you consider how we can use our report to influence higher education policy, what do you recommend we do with what we learned? How would you like to see our recommendations address some of the issues around lower college enrollment?
Yeah, we have quite a few policy ideas and themes in the report, so I'd encourage folks to give it a read to the extent you can. Definitely the executive summary and hopefully the full report. I'll talk to a few items that I think are really relevant in this current moment right now. And this isn't inclusive of everything that's in the report, but just a few things that I see as really top of mind when it comes to expanding enrollment and really Native student success. So first, I'd say it's really critical that we have a clear picture of how Native students are doing. We discussed some of the challenges that Native students are facing in federal data sets. And right now, actually, there's an opportunity to change that federal data for the better. So last year, the federal government issued new standards around the collection, aggregation, and publication of race and ethnicity data. It's called Statistical Policy Directive 15, a very wonky name, right? SPD 15 is what everyone about, data community calls it. Well, these new standards that the federal government published could go a long way toward improving data quality for Native students, but it's not a guarantee. So last time the government updated SPD 15 was in 1997, but it took the Department of Education nearly 15 years to fully implement the guidance. It wasn't done until the 2010 to 2011 school year. And then in 2016, the Obama administration tried to update SPD 15 in the way that the Biden administration did last year. But a few months later, the first Trump administration took office and immediately reversed the Obama team's work. So I think there's two challenges. There's a promising moment. There's two challenges we could face right now. The first is the incoming Trump administration may roll back the Biden administration's updates to SPD 15. But even if they don't formally roll them back, they could pause their implementation or even take more informal steps. Just, for example, continuing to delay agency rollout for years on end, like we saw with those 1997 revisions. So I'm nervous. I'm nervous that we may be about to just walk away from one of the most potentially helpful policy changes for improving the visibility of Native people in federal data, maybe in decades. So that's one thought on the data side. On the non-data side, I think there are multiple policy steps that can and should be taken. The Supreme Court limiting race-conscious admissions in higher ed really shapes much of the policy moment around Native higher ed. So given that, I think the first thing that's needed is really a concerted effort to educate policymakers and the general public that Native identity isn't based on race, but is rather a political identity based on tribal citizenship, and that efforts to support Native students are based on the federal government's trust and treaty obligations to tribes, and not based on racial identity. So that's in part why I've focused so much on the data issue. I think we need non-Native people to truly understand Native identity and the specific nuances that go with it. Next, I think we need to do more to fund the institutions that educate Native students. One way to do so, for example, would be to provide tribal colleges and universities, which are classified as 1994 land-grant institutions, with equal funding to other land-grant institutions. TCUs receive on average about $140,000 per year in land-grant capacity funding. Compare that to 1862 land-grant institutions, which receive almost $12 million per year in land-grant money. So you have institutions that were built on expropriated Native land that today receive almost 100 times as much funding per year on average as the institutions that are serving Native students. Equalizing funding for TCUs, my estimates have shown, would provide an additional $400 million per year to those institutions. And I think you can, so not only taking steps to support TCUs, you can look at boosting federal funding across other institutions that serve Native students. I'm thinking particularly of the Native American Serving Non-Tribal Institutions program, as well as regional public universities and community colleges that are located near tribes and tribal land. So funding is a huge part of this. Beyond funding, I think states can take action on things like tuition supports and free tuitions. Free tuition for public institutions for Native students. Taking action also to protect on-campus student supports like access to Native student associations or mental health and well-being initiatives are really critical for helping students persevere. But I'd say it's not enough to just fund higher education. We touched on this a little in the report. But right now, I think there are a lot of policy interventions that are needed that need to start early in life. So that includes things like expanding high-quality childcare, pre-K, for Native families and making it more affordable. There are a lot of federal programs like Head Start that need to be expanded and not cut. We need to do things like increase funding for the Bureau of Indian Education and for public schools, including Title I schools that serve Native students. And I think all of this needs to include raising teacher pay to attract and retain top talent to schools teaching Native students. And I bring all these up because I want to note that things like Head Start, ABIE, and Title I are all programs that are called out in some capacity in Project 2025. So rather than expand these programs, my fear is that the federal government may be looking to defund or eliminate them entirely over the next few years. So, in terms of specific programs, those are some thoughts. Finally, I just say, I think we need to pass more Indigenous education for all laws. These are laws that commit to teaching the full history of Indigenous peoples in state education for both Native and non-Native students. And we've seen these laws pass on a bipartisan basis in multiple states, beginning with Montana in the late 90s and more recently in places like Minnesota. Actually, California just enacted one last week. So there's some progress happening. But in other states, it's going in the opposite direction. So, you see examples like a county in Texas recently tried to label a children's book written by a Wampanoag scholar, Linda Coons, as fiction. It's a historical book, but they try to label it as fiction. States like South Dakota, Oklahoma, and others have passed, so-called divisive concept laws that are suppressing how teachers engage with history, including Native history. So I see a lot of backward movement right now, and I'm worried the next presidential administration is going to side with states that are suppressing teaching about Indigenous history. So my view is, at least over the next 4 years, I think that the avenues for expanding investment for Native students are going to have to go through Congress, but also through states, localities, and tribes themselves.
Thank you, Rob. Those are a good summary of some of the things that we discuss in the report that people can access more information about. That seamless education. And those concerns are daunting, but it is achievable. We've been able to demonstrate that we can achieve our goals by working together. But it is a good segue into, I'd like for Russ to talk about our concern that tribes are often not included in policy development in education. Even though tribes will often, I could guarantee that every tribe says education is one of their priorities, but their opportunity to engage in it from a policy perspective is often limited. So could you speak, Russ, to some of the recommendations for tribes that can increase their commitment and influence over higher ed policy? You could speak to things like access, data sovereignty, and partnerships. That would be great.
Thank you. I do really appreciate the conversation today. That reminded me of a story when I was a chairman, and I shared this at the meeting in DC. Is that when I was a chairman, they would pull us all the chairs together down at Aberdeen, and that's where they were meeting at the time. And then they would have these. There was limited funding in regard to what was available to the tribes, but they asked the chairs that were there to share this. It was a process meeting to share and prioritize what was important to them. And so when you get to housing, you get to roads, and food and child protection, law enforcement, what happened is that even though education was set to be a priority for the tribes, in that process work, education was found to be a little bit lower, and wouldn't make that cut for those top 5 or 10 priorities that they were seeking to fund, or with the resources that they were providing to us. And I thought, and this really came out, I think, as a process piece of that meeting, is that we talked a little bit about Maslow's hierarchy, and we talk about this place where we get to where we're healthy in our minds and our environments, and the lower piece of Maslow's hierarchy is just having a roof over our head, food in our stomachs, and have some safety and security and those things there. And the topic that kind of came out of there was that, or that did come out of there, as kind of, I felt was a theme, was that if we can focus on higher education and learn to better access resources for our people, then what would happen is that would help us to address those immediate needs, those survival needs that we have at the lower end of that triangle in Maslow's hierarchy. And so, so I think this is important for us, and it's important for tribal nations to realize that, and even though the needs are significant across the board for our tribal nations, that if we can strategically carve off a piece of what's available to us in regard to funds and direct it at higher education and build the capacity of our nation, then what would happen then is that we would better able to serve our people in that sense, because we would be accessing more resources. But policy is a primary piece of that. As we become more educated, as we become more capable of conducting research, of developing policy, and going forth with advocacy efforts in order to inform folks of what the needs are for the benefit of society. Because when we look at societal models out there, is that if you focus in on those with the most need, you raise the overall society. And I think that's the goal. I think that's the goal of all of us as humans, in humanitarian efforts. And is the importance of our governments and our sovereigns to do that on behalf of our people. It's not a new concept to Native people in regard to our potlatches, our giveaways, to share what we have with others in order to bring the whole camp up. So if somebody didn't have a horse, you gave them a horse. So there's things like along those lines that we think about in regard to this and how we approach these things that we're doing, and the importance of raising the whole society, the whole camp. But I wanted to so higher education, making that a truly a tribal priority to the extent that we're giving resources to that work. And then we already talked about data sovereignty. But here in North Dakota, due to the advocacy efforts of others before me, and we just, Dr. Jim Davis just passed away here this past week or so. But he was part of that work, and I see that Cynthia Linkos is an attendee an event today, but they were part of that work when that advocacy work that helped to garner resources from the state for the non-beneficiary students that we serve. And so we're still enjoying that today. And now the legislature is in session. We're seeking additional funds to increase that to help us to get the same level of funds that we get from the federal government for the Native students we serve. So having said all that, United Tribes Technical College, 70% of our population is from North Dakota, but we don't get anything for the North Dakota Native students that we serve. So I think there's some work to be done there yet, and to build on that foundation that was established by those before us in order to go ahead. So the other piece of that that comes to mind in this legislative session, in this last election for us as Native people, Lisa Finley DeVille, the Mandan Hidatsa Riverine Nation, ran a successful campaign. She's a 4A serves as a District 4A representative now in the state of North Dakota legislature. And we have Jamie Davis from the Turtle and Bannock Chippewa Indians, also won her race and sits as a District 9 representative, as well as Colette Brown from the Spirit Lake Nation. And then Richard Marcellet, who's also a member of the Turtle and Bannock Chippewa Indians, is also serving as a District 9 senator. So we have 4 people in the North Dakota legislature, and this is a historical time. And as far as I know, in the history of North Dakota, you've never had 4 Native Americans sitting in the North Dakota legislature. And I think it just supports what we're discussing today, and the importance of having representation within these sovereign entities in order to help get a foothold and advocate for, educate, and to garner resources to make sure that we're all being represented equally, to some of Robert's previous points on regard to equity. So I think I think there's some work to be done yet, but I think we're moving in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you. I just love this other good segues. So this is this need for increased resources, and I just want to say quickly that there is lots of evidence that financial support is critical to the success, access and success of Native students in higher ed, and I am always hopeful that tribes will increase their scholarship funding. And as one way to contribute to that and contribute to the work of organizations like the College Fund. So Mamie, we recognize that there's a large unmet need for resources, and that supporting Native higher education needs to occur with increased tribal, federal, state, and private sector fundraising. Or funding, excuse me, increased investment in research, policy development, and collaborations. So could you speak to the role that philanthropy has in helping, with the work that we want to do to increase student success?
Absolutely, and I think you're right that the segues have been very natural and perfect here. Both you, Russ, spoke about resources at the state level and some of the challenges there. Rob, you spoke about some of the challenges and ideas and recommendations around resources and resource equity at the federal level as well. And we see that there are challenges at both the federal and state level. It's always difficult to get more funding. I think we're going to be entering soon a even tighter federal policy environment from a resource perspective as we enter the new administration here. And so philanthropy also plays a key role in terms of resources and funding for this type of work, for supporting Native students and for supporting really intentional policy development and research that helps to enhance the higher education system and opportunities for Native students. And philanthropy can play an important role because it can be more consistent than political administrations at the state or federal level. Presidents come and go, Congress folks come and go, governors come and go. philanthropy, it can be a steadier thread throughout the various political changes there, and can play a really important role in being an innovative investor in these initiatives. I spoke earlier about the importance of authentic long-term relationships between Native-led organizations and higher education policy organizations. That takes resources, that takes time, it takes funding for both the Native organizations and the policy organizations to be able to invest appropriately in that work. And using IHUP as an example of many nonprofit organizations, what we can do, what we can spend our time on, it's really heavily influenced by the type of funding we receive from philanthropy. The same is true for many Native organizations, Native-led organizations as well, who receive small amounts of funding, often compared with other organizations. And so philanthropy can step in here and help to fill some of this void and help to invest in strategic and long-term ways to help organizations to build those long-term relationships, devote the important time and energies and research and policy development expertise towards developing the type of solutions that have been popping up here throughout the conversation today, and also through the longer and more intensive conversations at our convening several months ago. And so I think there's an enormous space here for philanthropy to invest even more fully in Native scholars in particular, as well as in this partnership building that helps to deepen relationships and knowledge sharing between Native scholars and policy organizations for real thorough sustainability of this type of work.
Thank you, Mamie. I appreciate that, because I think that kind of investment can also be more creative. I think that there can be more flexibility about the use of it, because often federal and state funding is often tied to specific legislative strategies or regulations and things like that, whereas philanthropy has that opportunity to be more open and more flexible. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. We're coming to wrapping up this activity. We've shared quite a bit of information in the chat, so I urge you, like I said earlier, to take a look at that information, read the report. We will be, in addition to the executive summary, doing briefs that are for specific audiences so that we can make readily accessible our recommendations, and really intend to have a robust dissemination process over the next couple of years with the work that we've been doing. Watch for continued webinars. We'll be also, as we release briefs, inviting specific audiences to come and talk with us. We won't always be doing a panel. We'll be having opportunities for people to engage in conversation as well. And then we will also be investing in helping Native scholars develop their capabilities around research. So we're really looking forward to that. Just a reminder that this webinar by the end of next week should be on our College Fund YouTube channel. We welcome you to contact us if you have additional questions. Thank you, Rob and Mamie and Russ, for sharing with us, and thank you, Carrie and Adaret, for being our great support, the foundation that holds up the work that we're doing. So have a good rest of your week. Thank you.